My name is Asmara Askedom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Today's speaker is Mike Mazarr, and his lecture is entitled How Nations Actually Succeed in Rivalries, the Societal Sources of Competitive Advantage. So Mike is a senior political scientist at RAND Corporation. Prior to coming to RAND, he served as professor of national security strategy and associate dean at the U.S. National War College in Washington, D.C. He's also served as special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and president and CEO of Henry L. Stimson Center. He'll be speaking for about 30 to 45 minutes, and after his presentation concludes, we'll open the floor to questions. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Mike, to get us started.
Thanks very much. Really great to be here. And to set your minds at ease, I probably won't be talking anywhere close to 45 minutes. So we'll go through some of the basic findings of this study, tell you a little bit about the purpose of it, and open it up to a discussion. It is a pretty broad and abstract topic. It's not focused on, sort of specific defense capabilities or technologies, but it does deal with what I think turns out to be the most important aspect of organizing a country's efforts for a large-scale rivalry or competition, and that is the societal basis. So this is a study we did for the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, with which all of you, I'm sure, are familiar. And I think that the sense from O&A was that we have had, a couple of administrations and several NDSs and NSSs now that have stressed this idea of strategic competition of, I think what's can be accurately described as a rivalry, major rivalries between the United States and Russia and China in particular, with China obviously being sort of the major societal competitor of the United States as the defining aspect of U.S. national security strategy. And we often tend to think of the immediate implications of that as being in terms of defense capabilities, specific technology, specific systems, net assessments of U.S. versus China in certain technological areas. Is our forward posture enough? How do we calculate deterrence? All of that stuff. But when you look historically, it becomes pretty evident that the countries that prevail or do well or succeed, however you define that, and we can talk about that if you like, we put a lot of effort into how to define the sort of the output aspect of this equation. The countries that do well because of their societal characteristics, because they are dynamic and highly competitive societies that in turn generate the economic performance, the technological sophistication, the levels of innovation, the military power, not only in general, but the efficient and effective military power that ends up doing well in a rivalry. And so what we were doing was laying the groundwork for what might eventually be a societal net assessment, in particular of the United States versus China. You can talk about Russia certainly as a major international disruptor, a major international competitor of the United States, but even before the sanctions that were now in place, it's not really, it doesn't score anything like the United States or China, obviously, on many of these sort of indices of societal competitiveness. And the nature of the Russian system and society is just not competitive in the same ways. So if we want to do that sort of a net assessment in this broader societal way, the first thing we need to do is understand what are the characteristics of competitive societies. And there's been some work on that in the past. There's sort of the business related work, Porter's work on competitive advantage, and eventually going into looking at what, the competitive advantage of nations. But that was really more narrow in terms of setting the context for business success, firm success, in a national competition. You've got work like Paul Kennedy, the rise and decline of great powers, and similar kinds of work like that. But that tends to, again, be very useful, but in its own way, a little narrow. We're looking at specific factors that led to rise and decline in particular time periods and not really doing a broader societal look. So that's what we set out to do, to try to discover what are the sources of societal competitive advantage. And we did that by looking first at the concept of dynamism and then choosing a methodology. And I'll talk just briefly about those kind of things. The starting point really was a concept of national dynamism. So if you're looking at national competition, what is it that makes a dynamic society that's going to compete well? There's been some work on this that tried to look at issues like vitality, national dynamism in general senses. And that was sort of our initial focus, was to look at the factors that produce national dynamism. But we quickly decided that that concept was just too broad and generic, and it didn't give us enough of a discrete handle about what was going on in society. It was just too hard to define. What we had to do is break it down into component parts. What makes for a dynamic society and a competitive society? And that's when we came to this notion of societal characteristics. There's a lot of kind of methodological discussion in the study, one of the appendices about other concepts that are similar to this notion of societal characteristics. That in itself is a little bit abstract, but we tried to define it as specifically as we could. The characteristics, not the policies of societies, not the strategies they choose, but their inherent characteristics that make them more competitive, and began sort of disaggregating the broader idea of dynamism into that more specific notion. In the process, we used a number of major sources of evidence. So there's a significant set of literatures really that have already done comparative historical studies in a variety of ways. A lot of them are looking at the sources of economic growth. What are the factors that produce that? A bunch of them are looking at what is called the Great Divergence. That is, after 1500, why did European countries leap ahead of the rest of the world in economic performance, GDP, military capabilities? There's studies on the sort of tricky issue of culture and economic growth and other sorts of and innovation, other kinds of things. So there's a variety of work that's out there that's already looked across history at different countries and tried to identify key factors that differentiate more successful countries. So that's where we started, and we began to develop a candidate list of potential societal characteristics from that broad set of literature. Is really hundreds and hundreds of different sources. And we conducted a number of historical case studies of our own, both internally and then commissioning outside historians to help us think through, ranging from ancient Rome to present day United States, or 20th and 21st century United States, looking at specific countries, empires, city-states, and asking, okay, when we've identified political entities that have risen to international predominance in general or in specific areas, what are the characteristics that appear to be fueling that rise? And compare those findings to what we found in the first phase and begin to narrow down our list of candidate characteristics. And then finally, we looked at more recent issue-specific empirical research. So as an example, one of the characteristics we came out with was shared opportunity. How well does a society sort of maximize the opportunity for all the people in the society get the most out of their talents? So with each of those questions, we asked the question, is there recent empirical research that would allow us to make a judgment about whether that characteristic produces competitive advantage? Is there evidence about the relationship between inequality and economic growth, between social mobility and economic growth, or social mobility and innovation levels? Is there empirical research about the reach of entrepreneurial capital to people in a society and what kind of differences you get if you change that? So in each of the candidate characteristics, we searched for that kind of more discrete empirical evidence that would strengthen our ability to identify it as something that is, clearly associated with competitive outcomes. And based on all of that, we ended up with 7 major characteristics that I'll summarize just briefly, to stress, even though a lot of the evidence we looked at was quantitative, this is a qualitative work of synthesis. Looking across all of history, there just isn't the data available to really do any kind of algorithmic or regression analysis to say, we can take this factor, quantify it in all these different countries over time, and then, give you a specific output of exactly what percentage increase it gives you. And then partly that's difficult because the outcomes we're looking at are not a single value, right? When we're looking at dynamism and competitive advantage, we define that in very specific ways, but it's a collection of a variety of different factors. So, we ended up calling this sort of demonstrated causal associations. So it's not the same thing as a determinative and quantified causal link, but in each of these cases, there is extensive historical and recent empirical evidence for the conclusion that each of these characteristics is associated with national competitive success. We don't claim they're the only seven. There could be others that could emerge from further research. We don't claim that we can say exactly how much each of these contributes or how much one versus another contributes to national success. There can be somewhat different packages of these, although I'll talk a little bit about how it's the synthesis that's really important. But the combination of all this work, I think, allows us to say fairly confidently that each of these is causally associated with what we would think of as competitive success in rivalries and general national positioning. So in order to sort of make that claim about demonstrated causal associations, and this is the last methodology piece I'll talk about, but I think it is important for a study like this because there's a lot of stuff out there, right, where people just start kind of pouring out very qualitative general claims onto the page about what makes a difference for countries without really grounding it in sort of rigorous causal analysis. So to make a claim of demonstrated causal association between a societal characteristic and elements of dynamism and national advantage, we ask 5 questions. Can we define that characteristic well enough to identify it, and if not measure it, at least have some proxy variables we can measure and tell whether it's there or not there at a given time for a given country? Is there a theoretical link? Start with just sort of hypothesizing, right? Shared opportunity ought to produce competitive advantage because the more people you are involving in your economy, your innovation networks, and so on, the better you ought to do, in theory. Then, do the historical cases show that? And again, we can't quantify necessarily, the Italian Renaissance city-state showed that opportunity gives you a 20 to 30% boost in these competitive outcomes. But our goal was to identify specific, at least anecdotal cases in the historical cases where we could say, here's an example of how that characteristic absolutely contributed to competitive advantage, and we can point to it. It was clearly recognized at the time, and by historians. We can't necessarily quantify it, but we can identify specific causal links. Then does the more recent issue-specific empirical evidence validate that in any way? And then are there strongly disconfirming cases? Do you have countries that become regionally, globally dominant, that rise to international predominance without one or more of these characteristics? So in each of our analyses of these 7 characteristics, I'm only going to very briefly summarize them, obviously, because I want to, leave time for questions, discussion, comments. But in each of the characteristics, we organize the analysis in these 5 categories, asking each of these questions and then, discussing the evidence that we looked at. So one of the things we quickly realized was that societal characteristics are not the only factors, obviously, that contribute to national competitive success. And so one of the things we did from the general comparative look and then the case studies was, in one chapter of the report, we kind of catalog the other sorts of factors other than societal characteristics that seem to make a difference. Structural factors, scale and size. The Netherlands is not going to be a strategic competitor with China, even though it is a highly competitive society in many ways. And that was one of the things we had to sort of tease out, was you can have high measures of competitiveness in countries that are not global hegemons just because of their size, but it still is an indicator that those characteristics make a competitive difference. Demography, proximity to threats and instability is a big one. If a country has a lot of neighbors that are unstable, if it has to fight wars with a lot of neighboring aggressive countries, that's going to affect its competitive position, even independently of its societal characteristics. Exogenous factors, natural disasters, obviously a big one, certainly historically has been the case, could theoretically be again. Climate change, even historically, and others. Other national qualities, these are not characteristics of a country, but they're sort of characteristics of its economy or byproducts of some characteristics. Energy production being a big one. Ian Morse and some other scholars have pointed to the ability to maximize energy production as a key competitive advantage and a key indicator of countries that rose to global predominance. The use of coal in Britain in the Industrial Revolution is a leading example of that. So while that's not a characteristic, it's significant. And then what we call non-societal advantages, this is just sort of a grab bag of other factors. Network position, are you at the hub of international networks of exchange, trade, but also intellectual and scientific exchange? That crops up again and again with highly competitive countries. And then a couple of economic things that are not, they're more policies or habits of actors in a society. They're not really characteristics. They're closely related to characteristics. And in fact, we had these on the list as characteristics for a while and then finally decided they really just had to be highlighted elsewhere. But they are productive investment. So the use of capital in society for productive as opposed to unproductive forms of investment, and then stable finances. Just a recurring pattern that countries on the decline have gotten themselves into highly indebted situations where the debt servicing just ruins them as flexible strategic actors. So we sort of describe all of these in one of the chapters of the report, and even in our assessment of how the characteristics apply to the United States, we briefly look at these as well to see where the United States is headed. Okay, the 7 characteristics we came up with. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Of course, we can talk about any of these at length. Each of them is discussed in a full chapter in the report, but I'll just highlight them because in some cases, some of them are relatively straightforward. It's not, that difficult to get the concept of what they're suggesting. The first one, national ambition and willpower. This has an international and a domestic component as we identified it. So the international component is countries that are highly competitive and do well in rivalries, believe that they are entitled to a leading position in world politics. They think of themselves as in some ways exceptional. They have a narrative and national mythology about their position in the world that drives them to take certain actions that makes them more competitive. There are countries that have had the size and the potential to be more competitive. And China in sort of the early modern era might be an example of this, very large GDP, but just at that time and in their way, looking outward, didn't have that sort of outwardly expressive form of ambition. But this characteristic also has a domestic component, and that is sort of a similar sense of ambition, demand for achievement, competitive drive, sense of willpower, in terms of domestic private sector activities, in terms of scientific achievements, in terms of cultural achievements. So this characteristic describes a country that is sort of full of itself, that is determined to make a mark, full of citizens that are determined to make a mark. And although it is vague and abstract, in fact, it's the most abstract probably of all of our characteristics, it is 100% associated with all of the countries that are that rise to the most significant competitive position. It is also, and I'll talk about the importance of balance in each of these. So one of our big themes is the idea that the route to success is not to turn each of these characteristics up to 11 on the dial, but rather to have a productive balance. And this is one of the characteristics where the balance can most easily go wrong. Excessive ambition, overreach, as Paul Kennedy and others have documented, is one of the most common routes to ultimate national decline. And this is part of a typical trajectory of great powers that have these characteristics that drive them to a certain peak, sometimes get financially overextended, and their ambition ends up having them take a variety of actions that are counterproductive and that begin to undermine their power. And that, combined with other aspects of some of the characteristics we'll look at, eventually puts them on the far side of their trajectory. And one of the obvious questions is the United States on that far side now? And there's a lot of evidence that we are. Second characteristic, unified national identity, pretty straightforward, right? Fragmented countries, multi-ethnic empires just have a much more difficult time governing themselves. They have more difficult time generating sacrifices in the name of the shared community. They don't have the sort of unifying national myths and narratives that justify certain national policies that make them more competitive. And then the other side of the coin is the very specific competitive disadvantages of being more fragmented, of domestic conflict, higher costs of domestic security, and all that kind of thing. The third characteristic, I've mentioned this a couple of times already, shared opportunity. When the people in a society can work, express, and develop their ideas, work together and network, contribute their full human potential to the endeavors of the nation, you get a competitive advantage. A couple of the modern historical cases, the United Kingdom, we can have a long discussion about how much shared opportunity, how much social mobility, how much equality existed in England in the 19th century, a very complex topic, but compared to a lot of its rivals, and in certain areas, in the role, for example, of entrepreneurs in the business sector, clearly shared opportunity. The modern United States has reflected this probably better than any great power in history. And you've got a lot of empirical evidence on this one, linking aspects of shared opportunity to economic growth, innovation, new technologies, all kinds of positive outcomes. The fourth characteristic is what we call an active state. And the idea here is that all of the most successful powers we've looked at have had a governing apparatus, a national government, an imperial center that took some actions appropriate to the historical time to maximize the competitive power of that political entity. Now, that varies enormously over time, right? The Roman Empire was famously light in its bureaucracy up until for much of its history, very decentralized in governance, but yet still the empire as a whole took certain actions in terms of infrastructure, in terms of building and maintaining a highly professional military, in terms also of sort of some degree of managing trade, monetary and currency issues that gave it various aspects of a competitive advantage. And then you come forward to the United States, and this targeted role of the state in prompting economic success, technological innovation, sort of the DARPA and ARPA examples of the technologies like the ARPANET leading to the internet and a variety of others, show the ways in which targeted state intervention in certain specific ways to maximize the competitive potential of a society is strongly associated with competitive success. In terms of our theme of balance, this is also one that can easily go wrong, right? You get to the Soviet Union of the Cold War and you have a very overactive state that constrains the competitive potential of that society. So it's a balance, but we didn't find any cases of strongly successful powers for their era that did not have some version of this characteristic. The sixth is effective institutions. So the idea here is this is one of the really most well-documented aspects of characteristics that make a difference in impelling competitive success. So public and private institutions ranging from central banks like the Bank of England and Great Britain's financial institutions gave it a significant competitive advantage, really ranging from at least the 18th century forward. But the work of Acemoglu and Robinson on extractive versus inclusive institutions, the Northian thesis, there's a lot of debate about exactly how important they are relative to other factors. But as one of a number of things, including cultural habits, strong historical evidence that societies with effective institutions are much more competitive. The sixth characteristic is what we call a learning and adapting mentality. This is, in a lot of ways, I think of sort of as the hub of aspects of a competitive society. It is, like the first one, a little bit abstract, but it's the idea of a society that is devoted to learning, education, mastery of science and the surrounding world, much like was noted in the first characteristic. This sort of groups and networks of scientists and innovators working together to share information, and an adaptation mentality that says as new things are learned, they will be applied. They will be practically applied to new products, new technologies, and in a variety of other ways. And that sort of basic intellectual energy of a society is a consistent finding across all of the most competitive cases that we looked at. It's difficult to define precisely. There's some certain proxy variables, some of this recent empirical evidence on education, R&D funding, other kinds of things, but it is just so characteristic of the historical accounts of Britain in the 19th and early 20th century, of the Italian Renaissance city-states. A case we didn't look at in depth, but sort of on the margins of our research, ancient Greece as well. You have a similar kind of theme. and then the modern United States in a lot of similar ways. So the final characteristic is diversity and pluralism, pretty straightforward. Diversity in terms of, even in the Roman Empire, diversity in a variety of ways contributed to an empire that brought in leaders and soldiers and traders and others from a lot of places in the world and made them Roman citizens and benefited from that diversity all the way up to the modern United States, which of course, and there's a lot of empirical work on this one as well. One of the best supported by recent empirical work on the value of diversity for organizations, for example. Pluralism, we attach to it, and that means something different in terms of a pluralistic political and social structure. So a structure with multiple nodes or multiple governing pieces. And a great example is the modern United States federal system, the role of states as sort of laboratories of innovation, policy innovation, and experimentation. That kind of pluralism tends to produce competitive advantage, partly through the competition that it provides. So those are the basic 7 characteristics. In addition to them, the study found a few sort of overarching themes. One is, I've already talked about, this need for balance in so many of these areas, but in a few in particular: national ambition, national identity, diversity, and pluralism. Going too far becomes counterproductive. I don't know if you could go too far with shared opportunity, perhaps not. That's one where the downside is not as great. But in sort of excessive national ambition, from ancient Athens to Iraq, a national identity that becomes constraining, where it becomes xenophobic and people are, immigration is demonized and outside ideas are not accepted. In each of these areas, the critical thing that the most successful powers have is a balance in each of these areas. Each of them is important. Each of these 7 factors is important, but what really drives the highest levels of competitive advantage is a synergy of all of them working together. It's the mixture of them. It's ambition combined with good institutions to provide the context for the domestic outputs of that ambition, and talent and opportunity, combined with a learning and adapting mentality, supported by an adaptive state. It's when all of these things begin to work together and feed on each other in a positive synergy that you get the best results. And so we called this, just for a phrase, the Renaissance spirit, which is this idea of all of these things working together. And as I say, I sort of see the learning and adapting mentality, the sort of intellectual engine of a society, its determination to find and discover and apply new ideas as in many ways the centerpiece of this. But it is a sort of a general pattern that you see in all the most competitive societies. And then finally, a general theme, the role of a public-spirited elite. That is wealthy, powerful, influential individuals in a society believing that they owe something to the society, that they have a responsibility to act in the common interest as well as individual interest. And this is never going to be true of an entire elite or establishment of a society. But if it is true of a critical mass of them, then you get a governing situation, a general situation of managing societal issues. It's very different when the vast majority of the elite is self-interested, corrupt, rent-seeking, all the things we know about sort of self-interested elites. And an obvious question is where the United States stands in regard to this today, and we have not measured that yet. So the final thing we did, having identified these characteristics and general themes, was to apply them to the United States and ask where we stand. And I'll just very briefly summarize this. We can talk more about it if you like. The basic finding is our system still benefits from the legacy of being probably the most potent recipe of this Renaissance spirit of any power in history. And we can talk about why that is, but you can imagine that where the United States stands in various characteristics is higher than most countries, partly just because of the passage of time and the nature of opportunity today versus in the past. But the trends in many of these areas, and 4 in particular, are obviously running in a very dangerous direction. National ambition and will. Hard to measure, but when you look at a lot of polling data about people's view of the exceptionalism in the United States, whether the country really should seek to make a mark in the world as it once did in the same way, what its ambition should be. And then, very difficult to put your finger on this. And we didn't try to speculate too much, quite frankly, but The domestic measures, I mean, there's certainly a lot of ambition remaining in the private sector, a very broad thing to try to measure, but there are anecdotal signs that in general, the society is becoming what you would call more tired, less ambitious, more anxious to live on its accumulated wealth and use capital not so much for productive, future-oriented ends, but for maximizing current profits based on things that already exist. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and some reasonably strong polling evidence that that's headed in a significantly negative direction. Shared opportunity, not falling off a cliff by any means. Measures of social mobility in the United States, by some measures, have held somewhat steady, but as Raj Chetty and others have shown, if you look at cross-generational social mobility, been on a significant downward slope since the 1950s. Opportunity for certain groups in the society certainly has increased over the last half century, but appears to have plateaued. In some cases, you even see some retrograde movement. And then inequality, increasing and increasingly institutionalized. Unified national identity, probably don't need to say a lot about this. Many measures of polarization. There are some debates about exactly how polarized the country is, because there are those who argue that when you ask certain questions, you find 60, 70, 80% of the American people agreeing on certain baseline questions of how the society should govern itself. But the evidence increasingly that people in different parties, in different ideological places, see themselves, see each other, see the other side, not merely as someone with a different view, but as an enemy, someone who's hostile, someone who's dangerous to the country. Of course, those numbers have skyrocketed in recent years. The political situation has become more institutionally polarized, gerrymandering and so on. There's exceptions. But that factor, that characteristic clearly appears to be running in the wrong direction. And then a learning and adapting mindset. There's a lot to be said here about education. We looked at a little bit of the data on that. I think that is a very complex. There's a lot of simple statements out there that the American education system is broken. But when you look at a lot of comparative data, especially at countries that are similar in terms of diversity, size, potential things like that, it's a complex issue to sort of get a handle on how you would model it or assess it. But the emphasis we put on here was on this idea of the degradation of the information environment, the rise of misinformation and disinformation, the rise of sort of information bubbles, and there's conflicting evidence on that too. But a sense that the information marketplace, which is essential to this idea of a learning and adapting society, is being corrupted and undermined by these trends. And to the extent that happens, it's an extraordinarily dangerous development for the competitive potential of a country. So in these areas, the basic conclusion is that the United States has enormous reservoirs of competitive strength in all of these 7 areas. And the problems are not so much structural, and we have not yet done that assessment of the China piece. I would say some of the problems China has in regard to some of these may be stronger in some, but the problems in other areas are much more inherent to the structure and character of their system. Many of these things could be addressed by some changes in public attitudes and public policy. They are remediable, but the trends are definitely running in a negative direction, and they are feeding on one another in a negative feedback loop, the opposite of the positive feedback loop. So I think, a conclusion that this certainly supports is that there is substantial evidence that according to our framework of what makes a nation competitive, the United States is clearly over the peak of its post-war competitive standing and begun to move in a negative direction. The question is whether that's arrested. So in doing so, this study was not designed to produce fine-tuned recommendations to say, because in addressing a lot of these things, obviously the question of which public policy is most effective or efficient is the subject of enormous debate. But a few broad conclusions. So this study does, so David Ignatius wrote a piece in the Post saying, we kind of catalog the destruction of the United States, and he's reading mostly chapter 10, which is the slide I just showed you. I think the study actually provides enormous spaces for optimism, that American society remains structurally more aligned and kind of by its habits and traditions and myths and narratives, more aligned to competitive advantage, certainly, than China or Russia is a whole different thing, but than China. If we can solve some of these problems, there's ample reason to believe that we can recapture elements of competitive advantage. The study does allow us, I think, to highlight some low-hanging fruit, areas where you can imagine public policy making a fairly rapid difference. I'll give just a couple of examples in terms of shared opportunity. There are plenty of examples of empirically validated, sometimes local, state level, other experiments or policies or NGOs that have taken actions that have measurable effects on increasing shared opportunity. One example is a variety of initiatives and organizations that are trying to bring more venture capital to underrepresented communities. That has very clear empirical support in terms of the effect that it has on economic growth, on technological innovation. And it's just one of many examples of the sorts of things you could easily identify. If you wanted to put together an agenda of improving shared opportunity, there are a lot of things you can grab for. In something that's related to characteristics, and then one of the non-societal characteristics, this idea of productive investment. So we've probably all seen the statistics on the proportion of profits and available capital in the private sector that goes to stock buybacks as opposed to new investments and to other things in terms of bonuses and so on. There can be federal action to encourage companies to provide advantages to companies who use that capital instead for longer term productive investment. The shareholder model, the pressure of quarterly stock returns, really daily stock returns, is very intense. That might have to be addressed as well by legislation. But you can imagine there's a number of proposals out there for changing the incentive structure a little bit to increase the proportion of capital that goes to productive investment. You could make a list of hundreds of those things drawn from our 7 characteristics and some of the non-societal ones that would give you an agenda of pretty straightforward, nonpartisan. It's one of the good things about these findings is, you can imagine among these characteristics, there are some, you could say national ambition and will and unified national identity and patriotism that are maybe traditionally more associated with one party, and then there's others in terms of shared opportunity that are associated with the other. What it adds up to is that the recipe for competitive success is a nonpartisan one, and there's elements from ideas on both sides of the political aisle. And an agenda like this could have all kinds of interesting ideas from both sides. But the opportunity is there. The potential to say we've identified certain clear characteristics, and here's some of the immediate things we could do is clearly there. Addressing some of the non-societal factors that have proved very competitively disadvantageous, resilience against disasters, resilience of our information environment, staying at the hub of global networks and not allowing China to come to dominate some of them, a variety of policy imperatives that come out of that conclusion. It does, I think, strengthen the current direction in defense policy of deepening our connections with allies and partners. This idea of being the hub of research, development, trade, idea generation, idea development, adaptation, and then drawing others in and building the most potent networks of those things, that's a huge competitive advantage. And so it definitely strengthens that current direction. And then finally, I would just say that this same framework can be applied to individual institutions or organizations. Within DoD, although we've not done this as an analytical endeavor, you could say, what are the things you need to satisfy these characteristics? Do we need what we call on ambition and will a new energizing myth? Some new general inspiring notion of what the national security enterprise is all about to sort of reinvigorate the ambition and willpower behind it. What kind of symbols of unity do we need? How do we widen opportunity? And I don't mean that just in terms of in a classically defined way, but opportunity, to get out of some of the restrictive career paths that exist within the services, things like that. Accountability and transparency to improve the effectiveness of the institutions. You could have an agenda to reform DoD built off these characteristics to increase the competitive potential of a specific institution. So with that, having gone just a little bit further than I wanted, I will stop and open up to questions, comments, and thoughts.
Thank you, Mike. That was very fascinating, especially your application to the US.